All right. It's 11 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I do have a lot to cover today, so we'll just make full use of the time. My name is Victoria Polchinski, and I'm a lead UX researcher with Enterprise Technology, and I'm here today to talk about creating accessible data visualizations. So before I get started, I do want everyone to feel free to interrupt me throughout this talk. If there are questions that you have and you want to just kind of stay on a slide and we can kind of talk through things, please feel free to interrupt. All right, so I thought I would start by talking a little bit about my data visualization and accessibility journey. This is kind of a niche space in the accessibility world. So I actually first learned about, and it was universal design in 2010 when I was taking a class here at ASU on design and human behavior. And a professor just talked about universal design. I was studying interior design at the time, and he spent about 5 minutes talking about it. And that was the only time I'd ever heard anything about inclusion or inclusive design, but it really stuck with me. And so I share that because for anyone who might teach or now or in the future, a big part of making things more accessible is just the knowledge, like letting people know that these things exist. Because if you don't know, you don't know. So fast forward to 2014, I was working as a UI engineer at General Motors, and I was really interested in the UX design space. So I was trying to learn as much as I could. I remembered that class, and so I started to do some Googling on inclusive UX design, and I stumbled upon the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much here. I am doing so many things wrong. And I remember feeling really overwhelmed, but also excited to know that there were guidelines in place to help me design and develop in a more accessible way. So I got my team involved. We got stakeholders involved. GM has a really, really large legal team. So they actually got involved too, because there are legal requirements around accessibility guidelines. And we didn't do everything perfect, but we did start to make things better. So one of the big things I just started with was I worked on a lot of applications for Chevy, and they had very similar colors to us at the time. So a lot of gold, a lot of white, and I had a lot of things that were like gold on white that just weren't accessible. So that's one of the places where I started. And then over the next 9 years, I've worked as a UI engineer, a UX designer, and now a UX researcher. And I've worked on a lot of very data heavy applications. So during my time at GM, I worked on a lot of applications that were for rewards and dealer incentive applications that were just very data heavy. So I had to kind of understand more about the intersection between accessibility, development, and design, and then also how that relates to data visualization. And then you never stop learning about accessibility. I do not do everything perfect. There's still areas where I'm continuing to learn and grow. So I really like to focus on accessibility as a journey and as just a way to continue to grow your skills. All right, so for today's agenda, I'll go over an accessibility overview. We're going to spend a lot of this time talking about color and visualizations. Then I'll get into typography, writing, device testing, and then I'll end us with some closing thoughts and resources. So for an overview, I did want to make a note on the language in this presentation. Person first language puts the person before the diagnosis. So for example, a person with a disability, whereas identity first language puts the person's disability as an identifier, for example, a disabled person. And so people have different preferences in terms of how they like to be described. Whenever possible, it's great to ask. I'll be using both throughout this presentation. So I just wanted to mention that the disability community recognizes both as good ways, just depending on people's preferences of being described. And then what is WCAG? So can I get a quick show of hands? How many of you have looked at some of the WCAG guidelines? Well, a good handful. I don't know if you're like me, but when I first saw those guidelines, especially 10 years ago, I was so overwhelmed. There was just a lot to know and learn. And I think over the years, they've really made a lot of improvements to making those more user-friendly so that you can figure out how to apply this to your work. But I am going to be using some of this terminology throughout. So I just wanted to start with, what is WCAG? So these are standards developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, with a goal of providing a single shared standard for web content accessibility that meets the needs of individuals, organizations, and governments internationally. So what does this mean? It means that it's over 50% of governments internationally recognize WCAG as the golden standard. So it impacts billions of people worldwide. And then success criteria are rated as A, AA, and AAA, depending on how important and difficult the standard is to implement. And ASU must comply with WCAG 2.1 standards and meet A and AA criteria. So it's just kind of a good thing to know. And then WCAG is divided into 4 principles, and those are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, and it stands for POUR. So as you kind of continue in your accessibility journey, this starts to become a really nice way of just framing whether or not what you're doing is accessible. And then there's a lot in WCAG, but not all WCAG rules apply to data visualizations. So Frank Ilavsky created Chartability, which is a set of heuristics or testable questions for ensuring that data visualizations, systems, and interfaces are accessible. So it extends some of those POUR principles from WCAG, and it includes compromising, assistive, and flexible principles. Frank is just a wealth of knowledge in the accessible data visualization community. So I highly recommend checking out some of his work, including Chartability. He's also a really big coffee drinker, and so he likes to use the visual of just pouring coffee. In this case, we have milk going into coffee to help visualize and help us remember that pour-calf principle. And then a few reasons to learn about accessible data visualizations. There are many, and so you can kind of just pick and choose what resonates with you. One is, like we mentioned in the opening today, and like we mentioned all the time here at ASU, it really helps us align with the ASU charter. So we're about who we include, not who we exclude, and this extends to visualizations. It also ensures everyone can access what you create in a way that works best with their goals. So even one of the things I really like about accessibility is it really helps everyone. And so that's in physical spaces, that's in digital spaces, but maybe someone benefits from a really descriptive title because they're a very busy person and they only have like 2 minutes to look at your visualization. And so that's just another way of helping extend accessibility so that things work for everyone. And then it's also just a way to improve your data visualization skills. So I've talked a lot in different audiences about accessibility. And I like to say that, like, you know, good design is accessible design, good development is accessible development, and that extends here too. So good data viz is also accessible. And then this is not the reason that I love to start with, but I am going to end with it. And it does help minimize legal risks. So sometimes when teams are really new to this idea, it's like, wow, we are so busy all the time. Who has time to like learn another thing? It is important to know that this is a legal requirement. But I think really the other reasons, like alignment with their charter, it helps everyone. Those are the reasons that I find tend to resonate with people and why they want to continue and learn more about accessibility. Okay, so color and visualizations. There are 2 big rules here with WCAG. One is don't use color alone to convey meaning. And then the other one is that text, graphical objects, and UI components must have sufficient contrast between the foreground and the background. So why not use color alone to convey meaning? I think this is one of the things that a lot of people in the data visualization community tend to know already. But this is about 1 in 8 men and 1 in 200 women have color vision deficiency, CVD, or color blindness. Color blindness isn't really like it's not a super accurate way of describing CVD, so I will use both of those words interchangeably here. But on the left, we have a stacked bar chart using red and green categories. And then on the right, apologies for this blurry visualization, but there's a tool called Stark. You can use this in your browser, you can use this in design tools, but it helps you simulate different visual deficiencies. And so it's not a perfect tool. Like, everyone sees, different people who have visual deficiencies will see things differently, but it does kind of help give you that like pulse of like why not use color and whether or not things will be perceivable to other people. The other thing here is that devices, environments, and settings also impact color rendering and perception. So even just the colors on this laptop that I'm using versus the laptop I use day to day, those are very different versus what's being projected here on the screen. There's differences there. But the first image I have of the Booksmira e-paper monitor, which displays in grayscale, this is just an example of why not use color alone. Some people might use a grayscale monitor. They might be printing this. And so if you don't have something other than color, people might not be able to understand what you're communicating. Working outside can also really impact color perception and contrast display. So when I first moved here, I wanted to spend as much time outside as possible. I was like, oh, it's so beautiful, especially this time of year. And I just wanted to do all my work outside. But I quickly learned that like a lot of things you can't even see outside. You can't actually productively do your work when you've got all that bright, sunny Arizona glare. And so that's just another example of how your environment can really impact color perception. And then the other thing is we never know what sort of settings people are going to use on their devices. Your phones, your laptops, your computers, all of these things have different accessibility settings. And so the image on the far right, I have a screenshot of Apple's. This is a color filter that you can use to change how you perceive color on your own device. So just another reason not to use color alone to convey meaning. And then there's a lot of talk that I've seen in the data viz space about, what about CVD or colorblind friendly palettes? Like if I do that, I'm fine. My visualizations will be accessible. But many colorblind friendly palettes don't meet minimum contrast ratio requirements. So this image here on the screen, this is a screenshot of a colorblind friendly palette from Cookbook for R, which is placed in a tool called 8 Shapes Contrast Grid, which I'll get into in a little bit more detail in a bit. But basically, what this is displaying is that most of these color combinations are not accessible. So if all of these were accessible, you would see every single one of these little squares. That whole white space would be filled in with squares. And so talking more about contrast ratio requirements, normal text has to be 18-point regular text or 14-point bold, and the requirement is that there's a 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio. And then graphical objects and user interface components must be 3 to 1. So that's especially important for all of the visualizations within charts. I am going to demo this contrast ratio checker really quickly. So this is just a handy tool. You can take any foreground or background color, input a hex value, and then it will tell you whether or not it passes contrast ratios. So it tells you for normal text, it tells you for large text, and then down here, you can see whether it passes or fails for graphical objects and user interface components. So this tool was really helpful for me when I first started learning about like, what is this contrast ratio thing? What do I need to do with this? And then how do I make this accessible? All right. Okay. So quick poll. I don't have any like Slido or anything like that. So if you are in the room, feel free to just raise your hand or shout out if you think this passes or fails contrast ratio requirements. We have maroon background and gray text. And if you're in Zoom, you can feel free to put this in chat. Any guesses, pass or fail? Fail, fail, okay. Getting lots of fails. Question 2, does this pass or fail contrast ratio requirements? We have copper text on a dark gray background. Double fail, double fail. Awesome. And then for question 3, does this pass or fail contrast ratio requirements? We have a medium gray text on a dark gray background. Fail, yeah, okay. So I use this poll to help illustrate that passing contrast ratios are not always accessible. And so surprisingly, all of these passed. They would get the check from WCAG, but the W3C recognizes issues with the current contrast ratio formula and is planning to update this in WCAG 3, but this could honestly take years and years. So there is a tool right now, there are lots of tools out there, but one called colorcontrast.app to check accessible color combinations, both for the new contrast formula and the old one. But what I tend to recommend is if you're looking at something and you're like, I'm not quite sure this passes, instead of constantly checking to see, does this pass or fail, just kind of think about like, is this easy to read? Because really that's the whole idea here is we want to make sure that people can easily read our visualizations. And if they can't, then it doesn't really matter if it passes or fails. I mean, it still matters if it passes, but but we should just try to use different color combinations that are going to work better for people. And then this is a contrast grid. I have in here all of the ASU brand colors. And I know everyone in here, some of you might not use ASU brand colors. Maybe you work on some other type of brand. So this 8 Shapes contrast grid tool is a tool that allows you to put in any colors you want, and it'll check to see whether or not they meet WCAG standards. And so instead of going one by one and checking every single thing, you can just go to this tool. And I'm just going to demo the tool real quick because it is handy. It's not showing me a ton on this screen. One sec. So you can take any colors. The link will be in this presentation. You can take this, you can customize it and make it your own. Maybe you're like, I am never going to use any of these colors. It'll just remove those colors. And then you can read it as this ASU gold and this maroon passes the AA requirement. If you scroll to the bottom, here's the legend where it says if it passes for AAA, AA, large text only, which is also applicable to graphical objects like your chart components and UI components, or if it doesn't pass at all. And then you can also filter things. So you can just filter everything that doesn't pass or doesn't meet that AA or AAA criteria. And then it'll show you the lasting things that actually work. So I also find this to be handy just to kind of get those grab those hex values really fast instead of having to look things up. Okay, so for UI components and graphical objects, I did just, oh yeah, question? It depends on which ones you're using. And so I do recommend using that Stark visualizer. So, and I also recommend, and I'll get into this a little bit more in a bit, but not using color alone to convey meaning. So you can take the ASU brand colors, you can make it look good for just, anyone, but then on top of that, you need to have some other component so that you're not using color alone. And those are things like shape, and I'll get into some of those other ones in more detail in a bit. Yeah. So I have used Color Brewer. One thing that kind of confuses me with a lot of these accessible color palettes is that they don't actually all pass the contrast ratio requirement. So they might be like colorblind safe, but then when you look at some of the other criteria, they don't fully pass. And so there are ways to make them pass, and maybe you take a subset of those colors. But the other thing is that, and I don't have the research in this presentation, but humans aren't that good at remembering more than like 5 to 7 categories either. So when you get into those, like, you know, and sometimes it's just like, we have a lot of categories. Maybe you're looking at things by campus. And so you want to color each one in a certain way. Like, we start to become really bad at mapping, like, oh, Tempe's maroon and online is gold and things like that. So I will share some other ways of thinking about how to visualize that data so that it does become accessible to all. Great questions. Yeah. So UI components are things like form fields. So a lot of times in like a dashboard, for example, you might have a search field, you might have a filter input field. So those are UI components, or buttons are UI components. And then graphical objects, such as each line in a graph. And those have to meet a 3:1 contrast ratio with adjacent colors. And so what I mean by that, and this is a terrible pie chart, so excuse this horrible visualization, but this is really just to illustrate these adjacent colors. Here, this pie chart has 2 points of contrast failure. Each of these colors has to have enough contrast with the background, which is white, and so they all pass here. But this dark gray and this maroon, that color combination fails. This maroon and this pink, that fails, and then the pink and the black, that passes. So there's a lot of ways to resolve this. One way would be to use just a white outline with this pie chart, and then it would pass. So now I'm going to get into a bit of an exercise. Here I have satisfaction data from a survey that was posted on ASU's unofficial transcript page. And I'm going to use this to demonstrate data visualization accessibility issues. And then some of the there's so many ways to resolve those. This is a real data set, and I wanted to use something that was real to just help show like some of the issues that we end up facing with accessible data visualizations when using an actual data set. So this current visualization, there are a ton of things wrong with it, and we're going to go through some of the things that are wrong and then how to resolve them. So one is this yellow-green palette isn't CVD friendly. And then there are green bars down here, which some might be able to perceive, but there's so little contrast difference here that a lot of this data might not be perceivable by anyone. And if you think about, like, here we have a pretty large screen, but if you're on your phone, you might not see these little tiny green bars at all. And so that is part of the Frank Olavsky's chartability checker, is like thinking about the extremes in your data and how do you make sure things are perceivable at those extremes. So one really simple color fix to make things more CVD friendly are replacing the green with this dark gray. I know it looks like it's black. It's very close to black, which also enhances the contrast. So we've improved it a little bit just by switching from green to dark gray. But now we have to look at checking for contrast. And so there's a few different areas of contrast failure here. That yellow key, that doesn't have enough contrast with the background, the white background, and then the gold bars don't have enough contrast with the background. And that, you know, we're ASU, we use gold a lot. So if you're like, oh my gosh, I use gold so much in my visualizations, I've been there. Don't feel bad. I am going to talk through like simple fixes for this, but it's just a very common area of contrast failure. And then the grid lines also don't have enough contrast. So we'll go over the grid line fixes first. There's a lot. Go ahead. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. So for those of you on Zoom, the question was around grid lines and when do they matter? Like, when do you want to maybe like not use as much contrast in grid lines? And great question. the option one here is to darken the grid lines. And I actually don't typically like this option. There is a lot of information in the accessible data visualization community around, like, this can make your visualization really noisy. And so it can really distract from what you actually want to tell. I don't think it's horrible in this visualization, but this is never my go-to, but it is an option. And I bring it up because a lot of this is just about thinking through your options and what makes sense for the data set and the visualization that you're using. So option two is to add a data table, and this is actually considered good accessibility practice for data viz regardless of your visualization. And so really what you're trying to do here with the contrast, you're trying to give people a way of understanding what do these numbers mean beyond just the grid line. So if our grid lines are really light, we don't have any direct labeling, we don't have a data table, we don't have a way for people to know what sort of values this means if they, for example, have low vision or if they're sitting outside. And then option three is to use direct labeling. I usually really like this as an option. I like to see, like, this is the exact number for this data. In this case, I actually think it's not very good because there are overlaps with the content, and you generally don't want to have text overlapping like this. So we have numbers 15 for neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, and it's such a tiny bar that it overlaps. And so I would reconsider this chart altogether, the direct labeling, or how to visualize this, because that's not great. And then there's a lot of different ways to resolve some of the contrast resolution. So one is to use outlines with sufficient contrast. Another is to use patterns. One is to facet the data. And then another one is to just choose a different chart option. So I'm going to get into these in a little bit more detail because there's nuance to all of this. So I really like the outline option if it's like, you're like, oh, I have gold, let me just put a dark outline on, and that can help resolve the issue altogether with having enough contrast. So I think this is a really great quick fix if you are using gold a lot in some of your visualizations. Most of this presentation, I'm not going to touch too much on specific tools. I have used a lot of different data visualization tools. This one is in Google Sheets because it just ends up looking better on Google Presentation. And one of the limitations with Google Sheets is that even though I added an outline to the bars, it's not adding that outline to the key. So in this case, I still have 1 point of contrast failure, even though I added that outline. Another option is to use patterns. I don't love this option, and I see you like shaking your head like, oh, cringy. Yeah, I think it's really easy to make pattern use cringy, but I did want to include this as an option because if you are, let's say, publishing papers and everything's going to be in grayscale, it's an option to consider. There's so many different factors in what makes a good visualization. This pattern, so Google Sheets also doesn't have, they don't have patterns, so this isn't an option at all. I did this in Microsoft, and then the rendering of it, I think this looks pretty bad. So I would not specifically recommend using this, but if you're going to use pattern, consider mixing patterns with solids. I think the even better option here might have been to use, dark gray for the most part for the bigger fill, and then pattern underneath. When you only have two categories that you're comparing, I would just use like a medium color and a dark color. I would do other things other than patterns, but it is something that's, I think, worth considering depending on your context. And then not all platforms have pattern options, so it's also just another thing to consider. Faceting the data is another option. I like this option when there are a lot of categories because it's kind of a nice way to resolve some of the direct labeling issues. Another thing you can do here is you can have one visualization that is more of an aggregate view, and then people have different wants and needs. So a lot of accessible data visualization is about flexibility. So maybe you want to have a good visual of like, here's the aggregate view, but then people can dig into the details with some of these other views. Now, one thing here is depending on what tool you're using, you might have to pay special attention to the y-axis labels. Using this in Google Sheets, it'll just automatically change the axis label, so you can really distort your data that way and kind of the story you're trying to tell. So you have to, like, I had to manually go in and do this. I use R a lot and ggplot, and with that, that isn't always an issue. So it just depends on the tool you're using, whether you have to be careful about the y-axis and how that might be distorted. And then another fix here is just using a different chart option. So there's a lot of different chart options you could consider here. Using a clustered bar chart instead of a stack bar chart resolve the direct labeling issue while keeping everything on the same chart. And then ASU Pink, I know this maybe doesn't seem as branded, but it is an ASU brand color. There is enough contrast with the ASU Pink and the dark gray and the white. So this passes the contrast ratio while keeping everything in the same place, not using outlines. I don't always like to use outlines because I feel like that can sometimes distort things, and ASU just doesn't use outlines a lot in their visualization. So I feel like it sometimes looks a little less branded when you use a dark outline. But how can we further improve the accessibility of this chart? So there's still a lot wrong with it. One is the title descriptions, and there's no subtitles or annotations to help communicate the information. So I know we're talking about data visualization, but a lot of visualization is also about that storytelling and knowing that people often like to hear those stories in different ways. So data journalists often do this really, really well, where they have a lot of context and they're filling in some of that information, not just with the visual, but also with text. I also have the second thing is I'm not defining abbreviations. So like what is AT or AT? Stands for assistive technology, but there's nowhere on this chart that I'm defining this. The third is like considering whether it makes sense to use separate categories at all. So right now, I like to disaggregate data a lot of times to kind of show differences between different populations. But I don't really think this visual is doing that. So it's difficult to perceive the difference here. And then the AT users are also a pretty small subset here. So does this chart even make sense for like what I'm looking to do with this data? And usually those are things you want to think about up front, but sometimes it's hard to anticipate this until you actually see it and you're like, oh, that doesn't tell the story I want to tell. Let me think about a different way of telling that story. Fourth is there's no X and Y axis labels here. And then number 5 is adding a data table and a link to the data or data source. And so this isn't going to win any awards for accessible or for visualization, but there are a lot of really good accessibility components here. And one is that the title and some of that subtitle really stand out. So if someone is looking at this really fast, you can read unofficial transcript app users are satisfied with the app. 89% of respondents were satisfied. And there's more context here. The visual can kind of help people remember this information a little bit better. The extremely satisfied and somewhat satisfied are just so high compared to the other answers. And I did end up just aggregating the visual of this data. And then I used an accessibility note instead alongside this to say that 84% of assistive technology or AT users were satisfied with the app, which is 5 points lower than the total population. And so I'm still kind of calling out, like, we might want to look into assistive technology users a little bit more, why they're less satisfied. This is still a good score, but instead of communicating that in the visual, it's communicated via text. And then there is a link to the data source. So maybe people want to know other things. They're like, who were these people who were taking this? What college were they in? Are they ASU online? Are they ground? So people can kind of dig into the data themselves a bit more if they want to. And then just information about how we calculate this. So if they do want to dig into the data, they can kind of understand a little bit more of the context. And then a few more visualizations. Here we have the most common desktop screen readers. this chart is a line chart from HighCharts, 10 guidelines for data viz accessibility. And what I really want to point out here is that instead of using color alone, they are using color in this visualization, but they also are using variation in shape and line, and they're doing direct labeling here so that we're not using color alone. And so giving people different options can really help with someone's ability to understand the data. I actually think on first glance, this can be a little bit difficult to look at. Like, that's me personally. And so this is where things like annotations or additional text might help a viewer kind of understand, like, what's important here? What should I know? What are the main takeaways? And then here we have a pie chart really displaying a lot of the same data. This is, I wanted to call this out because this pie chart allows users to toggle color patterns on and off. So there's a UI control over here to enable color patterns. This is another potentially good way of making things more accessible, just giving people options. So giving people freedom and control to choose the options that work best for them. And then there's also lots of ways to just control the download of this data. So you can download it via CSV. You can look at this as a data table to just get more options. Okay, moving on from color and visualizations. So for text and typography, capitalization, I just say avoid using all caps. And I think this is one of those things that you might be using all caps now, but maybe moving forward, this could be a simple way of improving the accessibility of your visualizations. So the reason why is that all caps reduces the word readability. And I like to, sometimes it's hard to understand, like, why does that reduce the word readability? So one is a sighted user might see hello world in all caps, but a screen reader typically reads all caps, and it depends on the screen reader you're using, but it's HELLO. So they're reading it like it's an abbreviation. The CSS text transform property can eliminate that accessibility issue. But the other issue here is that the shape of hello world using proper case has a more easily distinguishable shape compared with the all caps version. So like a dyslexic person who might have difficulty reading, they might use the shape of the word to help understand its meaning. And then someone with a visual impairment might also use the shape of the word to understand its meaning. And then this also, bonus points, it also aligns with ASU's brand and capitalization standards. So text size, Chartability has a heuristic here, and that's that any text must not be smaller than 9 points or 12 pixels in size. Ideally, only minor text is rendered at 9 points. So for example, the axis labels, while all other text is larger. And so even though people should be able to zoom in some cases, like we're all in a room here right now, some of this text is really just a little bit tiny probably for presenting in this room. So that's another reason why it's good to think about the context in which someone might be viewing this visualization. If we were in a room like 5 times the size of this, maybe this is too small for people to perceive at all. And then you should be able to resize text without assistive technology up to 200% without loss of content or functionality. You want to make sure that you're avoiding horizontal scroll and avoiding clipped, truncated, obscured, and overlapping text. So this image here shows there's text that's overlapping, there's text that's truncated without ellipses. This is often used as like ellipses. I see used as a design decision a lot. You're like, I have this content, I want it to fit perfectly in this context. But when I used to work on a lot of international websites and applications. And so we couldn't really think about, like, when we were working with German, like a lot of those words are way longer, or Polish. And so it just, things would truncate, and it's more important that people can actually read the content than having it perfectly aligned the way you want it as a designer. And I also often say, like, we're not doing this just for visual sake. There's a purpose behind it. So what are we trying to communicate? And then I use larger text on my phone. And so I actually have one app where I can't ever see my account balance because it's truncated and it's only located in one place. So just, play around with resize text. I also recommend just, you can, on a Mac, you can do Command+ and just resize the text larger. And so it can be helpful to see what the text looks like when enlarged. And then a lot of visualizations often have writing to go along with them. So keep your content clear and concise, right? Ensure clear sentences and paragraphs. Avoid unnecessarily complex words and phrases. If you're going to use acronyms, make sure to define them on first use. So things like the Web Content Accessibility Guideline, let people know that. Like Hemingway app and Grammarly can also be really great to just check grammar, fluency, and sentence structure. And then there's a lot on this screen. This is about writing good alternative text. So images and charts need alternative text. The exception to this is if you're using an image that's purely decorative. So if it's just for decoration's sake, you don't need alt text. But this helps provide information or function of the image that people using screen readers can consume the image. This is also helpful for people who are on a really slow internet connection, or the data is just being really slow to download. They can get some information about what the visualization is. And so Amy Seesal's article, Writing Alt Text for Data Visualization, recommends using the just the format chart type of data where reason for including the bar chart. So this is another thing that just kind of takes time and practice to learn how to do. I don't do this. I'm not like great at this yet, but it's just something to continuously practice. And then here's kind of another, what I consider like easy win for future accessibility within your work, and that's writing meaningful hyperlink text. So this allows screen readers users to generate a list of helpful links within their screen reader technology. And then the links also stand out for sighted users. So meaningful hyperlink text helps all users and to understand their context. So really common examples of no context. We see these all the time. We do them ourselves. Things like click here, view more, learn more. So without any text around that, we're not going to know what that means. Examples of something with context are things like class registration, loan application, or flu shot. And so on the screen, I have an example of the Windows Eyes link list. This is a screen reader that's really not in use anymore, but screen readers generate similar lists of links. And so if it reads the web page, it looks for all the hyperlinks. If they're all click here, you're not going to know where to go next. So that's some of the importance of that. If you are publishing these things, this is also good for SEO. And then I'm going to briefly touch on device testing. One of those things is keyboard probing. So interactive chart elements must be able to be reached and controlled using the keyboard alone. This is another good example of like a lot of times expert users spend all their time on a keyboard because you can just become really fast and proficient with what you're doing if you're using keyboard only. And then a lot of assistive technologies like switches, joysticks, they also use the keyboard API to make sure that people using different assistive technologies can control things with the keyboard alone or with their devices. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but I do recommend checking out Knowbility has a keyboard testing basics article. And this is actually like, this is pretty simple. So I think this is something people can learn. They can read the article, just start using it in your work pretty quickly. And then screen reader testing. So this is where things get a little bit more complicated. It's especially complicated with data visualization. But here I have a screenshot from Chartability showing screen reader testing for an interactive bar chart. I'm not going to go over all the details here, but I will say that the web accessibility testing website and video can really help just learn some of the basics of like, here's how I can download the screen reader software. So you can use VoiceOver if you're on a Mac for free. You can use NVDA if you're on a Windows machine. And there are things like shortcuts, and you can just start to learn how to navigate using a screen reader so that you can test your own work and see how it works. All right. So for some closing thoughts, this presentation reviewed some of the WCAG and Chartability guidelines for data visualization. but there's still a lot more to learn here. I cut a ton of content for this presentation. I feel like I probably could have talked on this for about 4 hours, but I'm glad it was only 15 minutes for all of us. But here are a few practical tips for incorporating data visualization and accessibility into your practice. So one is just improving the new work that you do. So it's often a lot easier to think about accessibility from the beginning instead of retroactively going and making updates to your visualizations. So just incorporate these principles into your new visualizations. Don't feel like you need to make things perfectly accessible to make meaningful change. So maybe start with you're like, okay, I kind of get the color contrasting. I'm going to work on not using all caps. Start with things that you feel like you can change today, and then just kind of keep learning and building on that. Make updates to existing visualizations. So maybe you just add a data table to some existing visualizations, or the source, or you add an outline to some of those gold bar charts. Another one is auditing one of your data visualizations. So Chartability has those heuristics. There's about 50 of them. Frank mentioned that the first time you do it, it'll probably take you close to 4 hours to go through and audit everything. Maybe you chunk that up. Maybe you're like, I'm going to start with the first principle. I'm going to see how that goes. But that's really a way for you to start to understand where you can improve. And then we have a lot of holidays coming up. For some of us, that means things are going to be busier. For others, maybe things slow down. So maybe that's a good time for you to just set aside time to go through those heuristics and see if you can perform an audit. And then the last one is to connect and critique. So, connect with your team members. You can always reach out to me. And if you want, you're like, I have this visualization, I don't even know where to start with making this more accessible, or connect with other people in the community, because a lot of times it's not a one size fits all approach. It's really about thinking about, how do we make this flexible? How can we make this compromising so that everyone can understand this visualization? And then I do have some resources here. Chartability is the one that I've been talking about throughout this, where you can get the workbook and just start auditing. So that's one I definitely recommend checking out, and all of the heuristics. If you were to scroll down, you'd be able to see all of those. Visa chart components. So this is part of a design system. And Frank worked on this specific design system. And so he has a lot about how to make things accessible for different chart types. I have WCAG guidelines and the accessibility website, but there's also some communities here. So we have accessibility at ASU. The design systems Slack community is very active. Design systems are huge in the UX and development space, but a lot of this could also be applicable to people who are working on data visualizations. So I recommend checking out that community. There's an Ally Global Slack community and the Data Visualization Society. So you can get a free membership, and that'll get you access to the Slack community, and they also have an Ally space there as well. So that's it for me. Thank you all for listening. I'm happy to take questions at this time. Yeah. So we do have a person who specializes in that. So she could help people walk through that. People can walk through it on their own. And then I work as a UX researcher. We are building up our practice to make it easier to test things with people using the actual devices, because they're expert screen reader users a lot of times, or some of them aren't. Some of them are losing their vision and learning how to use it. But that'll also allow us to test things with people who are actually going to be consuming using a screen reader natively. Do you have any recommendations for, connecting people with that evaluation? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah. Great question. Other questions? Yeah. Yeah, great question. So for those of you online, the question was, so this is, I showed a lot of static data. What about dashboards? Do we still use alt text for that, or do we use a lot of the text around the dashboard to help communicate? You still will want to use alt text within your dashboards. So things, and this is going into semantic HTML. So it depends on what sort of platform you're using, whether or not this is really easy to do or not, but you'll still want to use alt text. And then what I do when I'm using dashboards, where it's not just like, I'm not just looking at one point in time, I might tell some of the story of like, here are some of the big trends. Like if we think about call center data, for example, year after year in August, we see a huge increase in call volume when students are joining. So still providing some of that additional context it can still help with making things more accessible. Great question. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, like, as this is becoming a bigger conversation for both future employers, existing employers, all that stuff, so not just specifically to J Charles, but like I'm taking marketing classes, that kind of stuff too. What's your biggest tip to maybe in the job interview or early on when it's not the employer's like number one priority? How do we make that a more appealing priority for companies that don't really have this on their radar?
Yeah. So the question was like, how do we make this a more appealing priority for companies that don't really have this on their radar? This is sometimes where I get into the like, it is a compliance thing. So you can look up, there are tons and tons of companies who have, faced really large lawsuits. At GM, that was the thing that was effective. But this is also a huge, and I have this in a different presentation that I did for UX designers. This is a huge market opportunity. So if you're, looking at a for-profit business, for example, or people who are trying to include more people, like 26%, I think, of Americans have some sort of diagnosed disability. And so when you think about that large population, and it's something like only 95% of the web is actually accessible, like the more people we can get to actually consume what it is we want to consume, the better. And I think here at ASU, it's a lot of like, that's part of living up to our values is making things more inclusive, and part of that is making things accessible. So different places are gonna, like, some places you don't really have to, like, there's like almost no argument needed, but just sometimes it's just the, like, when I first started at GM, I didn't know about any of this, and none of my team members knew about any of this. So sometimes I think it's just that, like, you don't know what you don't know, and so just bringing it to people's attention is part of that too. Other questions? I know I'm keeping everyone from lunch now, so I can stick around if you have any other questions. Feel free to reach out to me on Slack or email if you have questions in the future, or I'm happy to connect via a meeting too if you want to just talk more about this and, like, just get excited about accessibility and data visualization. So thank you all.